First off, my name is Matt Anderson. I'm the Curator of History here at the Sioux City Public Museum. And today we're going to talk about the great influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, and we're specifically going to focus on that event here in Sioux City with some numbers and things that I unearthed in looking into this. This program actually way predates the current COVID-19 pandemic. This arose back last fall when the Sioux City Public Library was going to highlight a book called Station 11. And so then this April, I was intending to give an example of a community going through a pandemic, because the book Station 11 takes place after a worldwide pandemic that has wiped out a lot of the world's population, and these young people are trying to piece together the history of the previous world. And so this was just going to be a local take on that idea, the idea of a major disease pandemic. And of course now with history being what it is, we have something that makes it a study of this type of event even more prescient maybe than it was before. So first off, to give a little background, of course the flu virus is not the same as the coronavirus. They're two different things, but they have some key similarities, and probably the most important one is that they're exceedingly contagious, very easily passed between people. And they have somewhat similar origins also. So let's talk about some characteristics of the influenza virus. Let's start with some of the symptoms of flu. It's usually well known to most of us. The most dangerous part about the flu virus is that it's primarily a respiratory illness, and it can develop into severe pneumonia, which in turn is what can lead to the cases that are the most serious and lead to death. And for instance, in 1918, that pneumonia was the main killer of people that contracted the 1918 flu. As we know, there are many other symptoms that go with flu, cause headache. Of course, it usually a quite high fever that results in all kinds of misery, muscle aches and pains, joint aches. It can result in upset stomach, although what we sometimes call the stomach flu is not the same thing as influenza. And of course, stuff that affects your nasopharynx region, like a runny nose and sore throat. So those are all familiar symptoms, and many of those are fairly similar also to what is experienced with the various coronaviruses. But although they have a different virus that's causing them. Now, the influenza virus, as all viruses, this would be true of coronavirus, is a very, very tiny organism. We have an image here of the influenza virus magnified 100,000 times under an electron microscope. And so this is something that in the early days when scientists and medical professionals were first kind of speculating on the nature of viruses, really the technology had to develop before they could be even imaged. So we're talking about something much smaller than a bacteria. But in 1918, bacteria were well known. Medicines hadn't been developed yet to treat bacterial infections, but through the work of people like Louis Pasteur in the mid to late 19th century, the idea that bacteria caused human illness, that was well known. Hospitals in particular had put in place sanitation measures, which had really decreased human mortality in a variety of ways in the spread of bacterial infections. But viruses were a different thing, because to this day, the nature of a virus is very, very odd. A bacteria is clearly a living organism, although a very simple organism. A virus has DNA, but it's not clearly as much of an organism as a bacteria. And I'm not going to get too much into that, but a virus is a complex thing. And outside of vaccination, there is not a lot of, to this day, there is not a particularly, for instance, you can't take an antibiotic to treat a virus. Most people that know if they have flu, you can't, it's not like strep throat where you can go in and get to have the doctor assign you an antibiotic and in a few days it goes away. It basically has to run its course, and you're really, if you can't prevent it through vaccination, you have to just treat the symptoms and hope it, and try to keep it from developing into something more serious. So in 1918, the nature of viruses was not understood, and it really wasn't until the 1930s that they were clearly identified and they were seen as the cause of human illness. Now, so in 1918, most medical professionals thought that flu was caused by a bacteria, like other types of infections. Now, in 1918, even though bacteria were understood, there were no effective antibiotics until the 1930s either. The first sulfonamide drugs, which were the first generation of effective antibiotics, came online in the mid-1930s. And so those were still a couple of decades away. So if a flu case developed into some type of secondary bacterial infection, there wasn't a lot of effective treatment for that in 1918. The first experimental influenza vaccines, which were using a live version of the virus, were developed in the late 1930s in both the United States and Great Britain. And then during World War II, the emergency of the war pushed the development, first off, of penicillin, which was a even more effective antibacterial agent, came online in 1942. And then the first inactivated regular flu virus was also developed for the U.S. Army in 1944 or 1945. And so you can see we were in 1918, it was some time away from really developing what we would consider modern treatments for things like the flu virus and even bacterial infection. Now, the flu virus it originates with aquatic birds. Pretty much every time, and there are three main ways that the flu gets transferred to humans. It can go from aquatic birds like geese and ducks straight to humans without undergoing any transformation of its DNA. It can go from an aquatic bird to a secondary host like a pig, and then in turn from the pig to humans. And then it can go from the bird to a secondary host, or to a human, and then to a secondary host like a pig, and back to humans. And so there are several ways, and all of those create different strains of the flu virus with various levels of how infectious they are and their mortality. But the main, even though there are A, B, C, and D strains of flu, the main ones that affect humans is the A strain. And the Spanish flu is a strain called H1N1, which has come back several times in succeeding generations. Now, the tendency in viruses is to spread the widest. They tend to get less lethal as they become more communicable. They get less lethal. And so, for instance, I recall a strain called H5N1 that broke out in like 2003 or so. And that had a very high mortality rate, but it didn't spread real widely. So there are different aspects of it like that. Now, the 1918 flu is oftentimes called the Spanish flu, and we can see here we have a poster that was posted. I believe this is an Australian poster. It might be Canadian. But it's interesting, a lot of the same tactics that we're using today were used in 1918. So the medical people in 1918 had a firm grasp of how these things were spread and some of the things you needed to do to try to mitigate. And so when you read the poster, first off, they say there's no medicine to treat it, and that you need to keep away from public meetings, theaters, and other places where crowds are assembled. You need to keep the face and mouth covered. And so there are just a number of similarities to what we're going through right now. Now, the H1N1, the 1918 variety, have been discovered to have genes of avian origin, so it's pretty typical that way. It probably came, it's not clear whether it went straight from humans, from aquatic birds to humans, or whether there was an intermediary host, but most evidence points that it spread from humans to pigs almost simultaneously. So it most likely was one of those that jumped straight from aquatic birds. It spread throughout the globe. There were very few places, even on the most isolated islands in the Pacific, contracted the flu. It was so easily spread at that time. So in 1918, it's estimated that something like 500 million people around the world contracted influenza, and at that time, that was a third of the human population. So we're talking very, very communicable, much beyond right now what coronavirus has done. And the estimated death toll ranges from 50 to 100 million, and that is not clear. Some researchers really lean toward the higher number, but if that indeed is the case, either way, that's a 10 to 20% mortality rate. In a normal flu season, flu generally has a mortality rate of 0.1%. So you're talking about something very much more virulent. Even in the days in 1918 where there wasn't very effective treatments, that was just an extremely high death rate. In certain countries like India, for example, it's estimated that something like 17 million people died in India in 1918, 1919 from the flu. So you're talking, in some countries just had exceptional, depending on the situation, exceptional death rates. Now, most historians think it was called the Spanish flu because King Alfonso XIII of Spain became gravely ill with Spanish flu, and he was a real unlucky guy. He had gotten real sick during what was called the Russian flu epidemic in 1890, and so he seemed destined to get the flu. But he did survive, but it just so happened, of course, World War I was going on in 1918. We're getting toward the end of the war, but Spain was neutral during the war and didn't have the kind of censorship on reporting the flu outbreak that the belligerent countries did, and so most people just kind of assumed because Spain was reporting this flu epidemic going on that it had originated in Spain, which it almost certainly did not. And we'll go into that a little bit later about where it may have originated, but that is probably something that will never be determined. Now here we have a picture of a hospital ward at Camp Funston, which is Fort Riley, Kansas today. So keep in mind, we're during World War I. The U.S. had entered the war the year before in 1917. There are these huge military training bases around the United States. So you have all these young men gathered together in tight conditions, perfect for spreading communicable disease. Camp Funston was a great example of this. You can see it was in northeast Kansas, and there were 50,000 U.S. Army troops there at any one time. And Camp Funston, I point that out because that was one of the first places the flu was identified here in the United States. It actually was in the spring of 1918. And there were over 1,000 sick in early April, by the beginning of April. And by the beginning of May, 24 of the 36 big U.S. stateside army bases had troops that were sick, and over at Brest, France, where the main deembarkation point for U.S. troops in France, it also spread there by that time. And 30 of the 50 largest U.S. cities had reported outbreaks. Now, as far as the origin, there are some authors that speculate that the 1918 flu may have originated in southwestern Kansas. That is a matter of hot debate that probably will never be resolved. Others speculate that it started on the battlefields over in Europe, and probably the majority believe it originated in East Asia, which is mainly in the heartland of China, where most flu varieties come from. And there's a good reason for that. China is of course, very densely populated. There's a lot of animals and people living in close quarters. It's very agricultural, especially in 1918 was even more agricultural than it is today. And so the conditions are very much there in China for a virus to jump from a bird to humans and back between birds, humans, pigs, and so that generally is where most strains originate. Now here we have some more pictures kind of given a national or even international perspective. So first off, the first kind of wave of the 1918 flu started in the spring, and then it kind of leveled off during the summer, which is typical of the flu virus. But then the second much more deadly wave came at the end of August, early September. And this is the one that killed most people around the world. And so here in the fall of 1918, we have some pictures. In the photo on your left, we have U.S. troops at a hospital ward in Boston, Massachusetts, and you can see they've created a ward in an auditorium of some sort to take care of all these sick soldiers. And we have other U.S. troops in a ward at Aix-les-Bains in western France, or in eastern France, and also sick with the flu. And now I have some charts to show you some statistics about how this affected U.S. military troops. First off, so during World War I, 4.7 million Americans were in military service in 1917, 1918. And of those 4.7 million, over 116,000 were killed during the war. And we can divide up those deaths. 53,000 were actually killed in battle and in accidents of various kinds. 18,000 died of various illnesses for the most part, and at least 45,000 died of the flu. So you're talking about, and keep in mind, most of these came in the period from September to December 1918. So in that period of 3 or 4 months, 45,000 U.S. military personnel died. So close to half of U.S. deaths, U.S. military deaths occurred from the flu in that very short period of time. And we can transition that over and look in on Sioux City area military personnel and how the flu figured into the casualty rates for local military personnel. So during World War I, 4,384 Sioux City area residents served in the U.S. military. And that includes Sioux City itself, northwest Iowa, kind of the Siouxland region we think of today, southeast South Dakota, northeast Nebraska. And of those, 45%, or 51 of them, 114 total were killed during the war. 51 of them, which is 45%, died in battle or from accidents. And eight of them, so only 7% of other types of disease, and kind of a whopping 55 died of influenza or related pneumonia. So that's almost half of all deaths. So it really struck the local troops even higher, but it pretty much mirrors the national statistics. And then here we have another chart that shows just how severe, how quickly these deaths came. So the whole period from October 1917 to August 1918, only 8 local soldiers died of either flu or pneumonia. And then 41 of them died between September and December 1918, and then only 6 after December 1918. So it really is stark. You can see in that most intense period, that's when most of the local military personnel died. Here we have, so in the U.S. itself, it's estimated that about 29 million Americans contracted the flu in 1918. And of those, around 675,000 died. So the mortality rate, if those figures are close to accurate, and it's always tough to tell, the mortality rate would be about 2.3%, which is roughly in the area where the current coronavirus is for us. It's up in the 3% or so. But of course, our statistics right now, since that's ongoing, are fluctuating all the time. And here we have a picture of a flu ward in Oakland, California, at an auditorium there, and then policemen in Seattle, Washington, wearing their face masks outside. And so other familiar scenes we've become familiar with recently. Here we have the official report of the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Rupert Blue. And if you do read through it, it outlines a lot of the measures and things that have been instituted right now. Things like social distancing were very much a part of the program in 1918. And of course, there were instances where people didn't obey them and all that kind of thing. Now, where the 1918 flu really is different from other strains of the flu is the age of the people that died in the highest numbers. In 1918, the age group 20 to 40 suffered a disproportionate share of the deaths, and that is really unusual in flu and in things like the current coronavirus. Generally, the people most susceptible to death from flu are the very young and the very old, and then anybody that has any type of weakened secondary condition is also at threat. But you can see from this line graph, the dotted line represents the usual kind of curve of mortality from flu, and you can see it's high on either end. But in 1918, you had this spike between 20 and 40. And so people in the prime of life died, and that was really unusual. And most researchers, they speculate that there was something about the 1918 virus that triggered an overreaction of the human immune system, and that the youngest, healthiest people were the most likely to have this overreaction. It was what they call a cytokine storm, where there's just an overproduction of antibodies like white blood cells in the blood, and literally people would hemorrhage. It contributed to the pneumonia, but there were also reports of people bleeding from the mouth and the nose, and it's just a really unusual set of symptoms. Now, in Sioux City itself, in 9 months, so from September 1918 to May 1919, 451 Sioux City residents, or Woodbury County residents, shall we say, died of the flu. And I compiled these numbers by actually going through the death certificates during that period and counted everyone I could find. Now, I'm not sure how exact this is, but I think it gets us in the ballpark. And so that's a pretty high number of local residents, certainly much higher than would normally pass away in a normal flu season in Woodbury County. And 83% of those cases, of those deaths occurred in 4 months, so between October 1918 and January 1919. You can kind of see Sioux City being a little more isolated. It's kind of behind the national curve or the global curve. So it really struck here hard in October, where it had struck in September and other places. And then it continued a little bit longer into early 1919. And definitely the deaths really do, in terms of age group, reflect the global trends. And so you can see by far if you add the people between 20 and 29, which constitute 29% of deaths, and those between 30 and 39, which constitute 18%, and add those together, that would be by far the highest age group. The next highest is actually the very young in Sioux City, and that's ages 0 to 9, and that was 23%. And I can tell you from going through these, one of the unusual aspects of this was that women giving birth had a very high mortality rate during the flu. And so whether it was because of a weakened immune system after going through that or whatever, it contributed to that. And many of these mortalities for the very young are related to that. So women who died during childbirth or very soon afterwards as the result of while they were sick with flu. And then split it up according to sex, and there was more men than women in the Sioux City area died of the flu in 1918. Not a huge discrepancy, but 53% of the deaths were men and 47% women. And I'm not sure how much you can read into that. The main thing I would probably say in 1918, it was much more common for especially married women to be housewives. And so maybe they had a little less exposure than the average man, or maybe they were a little more careful. It's hard to know the reason for that. I want to set the context of what Sioux City was like in 1917, 1918 when this was going on. This was a very robust time for Sioux City. Sioux City was in a major period of growth in the 19-teens that was really peaking during this World War I era. And so here we have a photograph of downtown Sioux City kind of looking to the northeast from the kind of 3rd and Virginia Street area to the northeast. And you can see, first off, you see the massive railroad yards that were in the lower part of downtown Sioux City along 3rd Street and south of 3rd Street. There were several important buildings under construction in 1917. The Woodbury County Courthouse, you can see off in the distance, and the Insurance Exchange building at 7th and Pierce Street was under construction, and St. Vincent's Hospital was building its new building up on Jones Street at 6th or 7th and Jones Streets. So that was going on in this picture. And here we have another aerial just looking over from the east side of downtown Sioux City to the north. And so in the foreground we have what today we call the historic 4th Street area right in front of us. Court Street runs right kind of through the middle of this photograph to the north, and then off to the right is the Floyd Valley, and you can barely see the Floyd River and some of the railroad facilities. So that kind of gives you an idea of what Sioux City would have looked like during this time period. Here we have a picture on Pierce Street looking southeast from 4th and Pierce. So this is the upper floors of the Davidson department store. And these are actually Davidson Brothers department store employees boarding the streetcar to go out to Riverside Park for a company picnic. Across the street, there's the Plaza Theater, and in the distance, the Sioux City Tribune newspaper headquarters. And so something that stands out to me about these photos is that Sioux City was a lot denser town in 1918 than it is today. So in 1918, there were approximately 70,000 people in Sioux City, so the population wasn't that much different. But Sioux City, in terms of the land area it took up, was smaller than it is today. People were concentrated together more, and especially downtown was the center of activity, of especially all economic activity. And so you could see where a communicable disease like flu could pass very easily in an environment like this. Really downtown it isn't like this very often in our time. Here we have a picture on the north side up at 28th and Jackson Streets looking to the south, and these are the homes south of 28th Street along the east side of Jackson, and they're all still there, these brick homes that line up there. And so you can kind of see some of the older neighborhoods that still exist today and what they looked like at that time. Now, something that probably contributed to the severity of the 1918 flu was World War I and the very large military installations that were all around the world. And Sioux City itself had some major military installations. So in 1917, the U.S. entered World War I in April of 1917. And that summer, in June, the local National Guard units took over what was called the Interstate Fairgrounds, which are in the area over by Riverside Park, where the Riverside Fairway and the Red Cross facility and such are today. And so this was a big fairgrounds where the Sioux City Interstate Fair took place every year. And you can see in this picture, these National Guard troops are practicing digging trenches, which was a very much characteristic of the warfare during World War I. So here you can see all the fair facility. You see part of the grandstand and some of the buildings that were on those fairgrounds. And here we have an ambulance unit that was part of the Iowa National Guard, and they're practicing with stretchers. And so again, this type of situation, very easy to pass a disease like the flu. You also had a lot of people gathering together, pooling together, and being transported to different parts of the country. And so here we have a view of Sioux City men who are officer candidates to go up to Fort Snelling, Minnesota in the fall of 1917. To see if they qualify to become a U.S. Army officer. And so this is at the Union Passenger Station, which was at the southwest corner of 3rd and Pierce Streets at the time. And so you see people coming together for that. Now, the very first Sioux City area resident to die in U.S. military service during World War I was Private Ralph Church. And he was in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. And he contracted typhoid fever while he was serving at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and he died in August of 1917. And he was brought back to Sioux City, and we happen to have a picture of his funeral that when he was brought back to Sioux City. And so here we have the funeral procession going down Pierce Street. This picture is south of 7th Street on Pierce, and we're looking to the northeast corner of 7th and Pierce is where the old YMCA building was at the time. Here we have a picture of one of the parades that was held during World War I. One of the ways the U.S. government raised money from civilians during World War I were what were called Liberty Loans. And this is a parade for the 3rd Liberty Loan Drive in April of 1918. And we're at the northeast corner of 4th and Douglas Streets in the Hedges block building, looking to the south, to the southwest across the intersection. Something that stands out to me, first off, in this picture, the marchers, I'm not sure if they are nurses, but it's a group of women, and they may well be suffragettes as well, or some type of organization promoting that, because keep in mind the women's suffrage movement was nearing its final goal in 1918 and would come into law a couple of years later. And another thing that stands out to me is at the corner of 4th and Douglas, across the street is the Ideal Bar. Well, at this time, Iowa was officially under prohibition. It had outlawed alcohol at the beginning of 1916, and so you can see there's a sign for Anheuser-Busch, and they're serving Bevo, which was Anheuser-Busch's non-alcoholic beer that they sold during Prohibition. And so that stands out as well in this photo. Here we have another image of the same procession for the 3rd Liberty Loan. Only we have some local National Guard troops going through on parade. And again, so here's another way, in this atmosphere during the war, people were gathering together in large numbers, and no doubt contributed to spreading the flu virus. Here we have a picture of one of the local National Guard troops, Company D, on Memorial Day in 1918. So this is the 30th of May, 1918. And this is a great panoramic photo that we have of this unit. And they're actually in front of what today is City Hall at 6th and Douglas Street. We're just east of City Hall. Today's City Hall. At that time, what today is City Hall was the federal building where the federal courthouse and the post office were. And then across the street in the distance, you see another stone building. That was City Hall at that time at the northeast corner of 6th and Douglas Streets. There was a training detachment headquartered at Sioux City High School in 1918. So in July of 1918, the U.S. Army brought 180 draftees into Sioux City, and they headquartered them at Sioux City High School, which later became Central High School. And they trained them in radio operation, telegraphy, and woodworking. And so this is a way they were trying to quickly train basically raw recruits into doing different types of military activities. And here in this photo, same group, they're on the lawn of Sioux City High School, practicing semaphore, which is the flag waving signals, and others are working with a radio field station. And World War I was the first conflict in which radio, which was a very new invention, was used in a large amount. And so that's a very new technology that they're working with there. And then finally, the other major military installation in Sioux City was out at Morningside College, where there was what was called the Student Army Training Corps, and the commander was Lieutenant Harry Brown, and this is where college-age students would do various types of military training in preparation for going into military service, possibly eventually as officers. And so there were really the Student Army Training Corps really took over the Morningside campus in 1917, especially in 1918. And so there were larger numbers out at the college, and it was one of the installations here in Sioux City that really got hit hard by the flu virus in the fall of 1918. And finally, we want to talk about some notable people during this period and some other things that happened around this time. First off, on the 29th of June, 1918, the worst single disaster in Sioux City's history, outside of the crash of Flight 232, was the collapse of the Hedges block building. So this building that we saw what the photo of the Liberty Loan Parade a few slides earlier, at the end of June 1918 collapsed, and it was during a remodeling project. It was an older building, it had been built in the 1870s, and during the remodeling, some internal support was taken away. All the businesses that occupied the building were running during the remodeling, and so when the building collapsed and burned, 39 people were killed, and that's the single worst fire/accident in Sioux City's history to this day. And there was all kinds of outcry after this because a lot of shortcuts had been taken in this project. So for one thing, the Commissioner of Public Safety, William R. Hamilton, who was in charge of the police and fire department, he ordered the serving whiskey to people who came to the scene as first responders. And of course, keep in mind this is during Prohibition, here in Iowa anyway. And so that was not a great look. But the worst thing was that the acting building inspector was Edward J. O'Connor, who was actually more of a political operative, and he had gotten he had run the campaign of Sioux City's mayor at the time, Wallace Short, who we'll get to shortly. And O'Connor was not a trained engineer, but he kind of got the office of building inspector for running a successful campaign for Short, and he checked off on the plan to remodel the Hedges block, and it clearly shouldn't have been allowed. The plans shouldn't have been allowed, and so from that point on, the city building inspector had to be a trained engineer. So a hard lesson was learned from that. As a result of the Hedges block collapse, Commissioner Hamilton and Building Inspector O'Connor were both removed from office. It caused a lot of trouble for Sioux City's mayor at the time, Reverend Wallace Short, who's one of the real colorful characters in Sioux City's history. He was originally he came to Sioux City as a minister at the First Congregational Church, but he had some interesting views. He despite being a Protestant minister, he was against prohibition, so he was what was called a wet at the time. And he was also very pro-labor and pro-labor union. And this is during the period where the organized labor movement in America was starting to gain steam. And he was there was a lot of resistance of Short in the business community in Sioux City. And as after the collapse of the Hedges block, there was a movement to recall Mayor Short, and in 1919, there was a recall election where another candidate ran against Short, but lost, and so Short remained in office and ended up serving 2 more terms as mayor until 1924. Another Sioux City person that was an important official during this period was William L. Harding, who went to Morningside College and later to USD and was a lawyer here in Sioux City. And he was Iowa's governor during World War I. He served 2 terms as Iowa governor between 1917 and 1921. He had been lieutenant governor for 4 years before that. But he's probably, to most people, Governor Harding is most remembered for his language proclamation of May 1918. So keep in mind, this is a period where there's a lot of anti-German sentiment, in particular in the United States, us having entered the war. Basically, the language proclamation outlawed the use of any foreign language outside of English in a public setting, and that included over the phone, in church, and of course in 1918 there were a lot of foreign language churches around, and different denominations would have several different branches of foreign language churches, and so in school it couldn't be used, and so the language proclamation was very divisive from the beginning, and that's something that very much has colored the view of William Harding's terms as governor. One of the prominent businessmen of Sioux City to die during the influenza, so the flu struck everybody in society, not the poor, the wealthy, the young, the old. It really didn't. That's something about communicable diseases. It kind of knows no bounds. And one of the people to pass away was Melvin J Smith, who died of flu complications in October of 1918, and he was only 47 years old, so he wasn't a real old guy. He was mostly a financier, which would have been basically a banker, but he was also heavily involved in real estate, and ironically, one of his real estate companies had owned the Hedges block, so he had been involved in that whole scandal a few months earlier. So that's one of the odd connections that I've found. Now, Sioux City had a pretty robust system of healthcare facilities in 1918. Depending on how you count them, Sioux City had about 8 different hospitals at that time, and was pretty well regarded in terms of the doctors that were here in town. So the oldest Sioux City hospital was the Samaritan Hospital, located at the northwest corner of 17th and Pierce Streets. The building that we see here was constructed in 1893 and was still being used in 1918. Samaritan Hospital was co-founded by Dr. William Jepson and the Women's Christian Association. And so it was established in 1888 and then operated until 1924 when it merged with the Methodist Hospital. Dr. Jepson also was involved in founding St. Joseph's Hospital. So in 1890, he co-founded St. Joseph's Hospital with the Sisters of Mercy. So St. Joseph was a Catholic-run hospital. First they took over an old home of real estate developer John Pierce at the northeast corner of 21st and Court Street. In 1899, they built a larger building, and then in this postcard that we're looking at here, you can see the 1911 edition. And St. Joseph's for many years was by far Sioux City's largest hospital, and certainly would have been in 1918. Here we have some pictures of Sioux City nurses who had just graduated from St. Joseph's School of Nursing. And they were going to go down. They volunteered to go down to Camp Dodge in Johnston, Iowa, to help take care of the troops that had gotten sick there with the flu. And so we have in clockwise order. You have Rose Bruner, Rita Costello, Minnie Scannell, and Nellie Riley pictured here. So you see how Sioux City people were contributing there. Here we have the German Lutheran Hospital, later just to be the Lutheran Hospital, founded in 1901 by Dr. Soren W. Stodds and a group of Sioux City Lutherans interested in establishing a hospital. Located at the northeast corner of 27th and Pierce. You can see originally it started out in an old house, and then in 1910 a brick addition was added. And we have another one of William Jepson's hospitals that he founded was St. John's Hospital. established in 1918 by Dr. Jepson. It was located at the northeast corner of 14th and Jones Streets, and this was the former building for the Sioux City College of Medicine, which was another thing that Dr. Jepson was involved in. Now, during World War I, William Jepson was serving in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, so he was outside of Sioux City, and the St. John's kind of was at the end of its run as a hospital, and so he offered the St. John's building over to the city of Sioux City to use as a flu ward because just like today, when the flu hit, the hospitals were easily overwhelmed, and so that was used as an extra place to care for patients. Later, this building served as the first home of the Methodist Hospital when it started running in 1920. Another fairly new hospital at that time was called the Maternity Hospital. It was at the northwest corner of 28th and Iowa Streets, and it was right next door to the Florence Crittenden home. You can barely see it on the far left side of this photo. And it was founded by Dr. Agnes Eichelberger, who was one of the few female Sioux City physicians at this time. And the reason she was interested in the maternity hospital was that the maternity wards in the other Sioux City hospitals oftentimes weren't clearly separated from the regular hospital patients. So you had, babies being born very close to people that were sick with various diseases, and so this was a way to isolate women and their babies from that. And of course, the Crittenden home was involved in helping girls that had become pregnant outside of wedlock at the time, and so that was one reason it was located where it was. Now, by the 1920s, the Sioux City hospitals had developed maternity wings, and so they'd kind of taken over this part of the business, and Agnes passed away in the early 1920s, and so it ended up closing in 1928 and became the Methodist Hospital's nurses' home. Here we have a couple of city and county-run homes. First off, you have the Sioux City Detention Hospital. Now, these buildings were located on Sawyer's Bluff, which is at the south end of the Stockyards District up on the hill. And the Detention Hospital was in the old James Sawyer's mansion at the time. And it was literally a place where people that couldn't afford to go to a regular hospital, kind of maybe the homeless, transient population that became sick with a communicable disease, whether it be tuberculosis or any number of different ailments that were infectious, basically were detained and to keep them from spreading it around. And this is a pretty common practice at this time in cities around the United States and in other countries. In 1915, a separate building was built to be the tuberculosis sanatorium. So tuberculosis was something that was very common at the time, and it was a way to isolate patients with that disease. Yet another small hospital was the Hillside Sanitarium, another one of the hospitals founded by Dr. Soren Stodds. It started out in the house you see here in the center in 1916. This is at the northwest corner of West 19th and West Streets. And then the brick building on the far left side was added in 1919, and that brick building still exists to this day out there. I think it's used as kind of an apartment building. And then finally, the newest hospital in 1918 was St. Vincent's new building. At the southeast corner of 7th and Jones Streets. It opened in 1917. St. Vincent's itself was founded by the Benedictine sisters in 1907. And originally they used the former Fred T. Evans home at the southwest corner of 7th and Pierce Streets. But by this time, their operation had expanded to require a larger building. And so this was the second Catholic-associated hospital opened in Sioux City. Eventually, St. Vincent's and St. Joseph's in the 1960s were combined into what today is Mercy One. And here we have a view of what the inside of St. Vincent's would have looked like. Here we have the librarian, Rose O'Connor, distributing books to the patients. And so, at this time, there weren't a lot of things like private rooms and things that we expect today. So people were kind of in a ward together. And then finally, I'm going to finish up with a few kind of funny ads, I think, that I found in the paper during this time related to the flu epidemic, kind of end on a lighter note. So this is the United States, and Americans always figure out a way to make money off any situation. And so here we have the first off, Elf's wallpaper paint and glass company was pointing out that glass was a good way to seal you away from people with flu. And so they were using Spanish influenza to advertise their product. And of course, this was still the kind of the prime period of what were called patent medicines. And there were tons of these. They were just starting to be regulated, some by the U.S. government in this period. But they'd been around all through most of the 19th century. A lot of them in the earlier times had contained a lot of alcohol and all kinds of other drugs and things. But one of them here, we have Dr. Hartman's Peruna. I assume it might be prune-based, not sure for sure, but but being advertised as something to treat influenza, which of course it almost certainly did not. You had Father John's medicine. At this time they called the flu oftentimes the grip, from the Spanish term la grippe, and so it. You see that, and of course, so that was another thing to treat flu. Even Horlick's malted milk was being advertised as something to keep your strength up, to help you recover from the flu or to prevent you from getting it. You had something called the oil of Hyome being advertised to treat flu patients, and and then finally, good old-fashioned Vicks VapoRub as another thing to help clear the congestion that you would get from the flu. I think that's a good way to see how people tried to use it in a positive way, tried to use the flu epidemic to sell their product.